Earlier this week, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the South Africa and China relationship had been promoted from a comprehensive strategic partnership to an all-round strategic cooperative partnership. This followed his state visit to China with a South African delegation on Monday, where he and Xi Jinping agreed to promote balanced trade and two-way investments between the two countries. But do these ensemble of words really mean anything in terms of improving trade and investment for South Africa and the jobs one would hope could come from an intensity in this kind of economic activity? Well, to give us his take on recent developments, I'm joined by Professor Cyril. He's from the Gordon Institute of Business Science, also known as GIBS. He wears many hats. He has hats in the world of academia, investment and business. Thanks very much, Adrian, for joining us. So under what was termed, you're welcome. So under what was termed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between South Africa and China, were there any noticeable economic benefits derived from that? And for South Africa, and what do you anticipate will materialize under the new all-round strategic cooperative partnership going forward?
I think it's useful to take a step back first, and recognize that what's happening in terms of global economic tectonic plates and the shifting that has happened over the last 20, 30 years sees China rise to prominence. That economic importance isn't going to be reversed anytime soon. And in fact, if we fast forward perhaps another 20, 25 years, it's well within the realms of possibility that the world's two largest economies will be BRIC members, namely India and China. And so South Africa aligning with China in this way is an extension of the early BRICS alignments of the 2000s, the early 2000s. So it's an extension of that. There's elements that are formalized. Having said all of that, we are quite hard pressed to find evidence that South Africa being a member of BRICS has led to substantial improvement and significant impact on South Africa's social, economic, industrial prosperity and well-being. So as things stand, I take this as a valuable policy position. What we really need to see is this translated from words, as you suggested, into action.
Absolutely. So, of course, at the FOCAC meeting, Xi Jinping apparently has undertaken to commit $50 billion to the African continent to help with development, which is very positive. And there's also talks around, tariff-free exports from African countries into China, which is quite, positive. That is quite a leap, isn't it? Because before there hasn't been that.
Yeah, let me try and not be the grumpy economist, and say that absolutely, there are positives here in terms of access to the Chinese market, which is this is a massive market. Continuing to enjoy positive growth. There's likely to be a very large consumer stimulus that is still to be had out of China's economic transition. Having said that, $50 billion is a drop in the ocean when we put it up against the size of the broader African economy. And to give you a sense, of just how modest this number is, I'm not saying, we should snub this, but it is a modest number in the greater scheme of things. The African continent needs about $100 billion per annum to get infrastructure into the same network density as India or China. So this is a positive step, but it's very, very modest in the greater scheme of things. Second, let's not talk about China. Let's rather talk about AGOA. And when we look at the impacts that AGOA giving African manufacturers access to the North American market, what evidence do we find of that, having been transformative? Very, very modest evidence. So, really there is something missing between the policy ambition and our ability to get from that prospect into the reality. And that is the missing component is about the investments that need to happen to get African economies, broadly speaking, into the position that they can compete in other markets with value-added manufactured goods.
Yeah, you bring me to my next question, really, which is, what do you think of South Africa's current industrial policy? Because obviously that's very key. You know, we can have different countries, you know, cutting us some slack, you know, cutting tariffs here and there, but ultimately we need a good industrial base, and that needs to be a competitive base. Do you think that perhaps South Africa needs to revamp or relook at its industrial policy? Where are we getting it wrong?
I think that this is a huge conversation, and I don't imagine we can do justice to it in a couple of minutes. But to make, I think, two important points. The first is that South Africa has experienced a steady erosion or corrosion of manufacturing capability. We could evidence this in at least two ways. The first is in the 1980s, 1990s, South Africa's exports accounted for about 1.5% of world exports. Today, that number is less than 0.5%. In other words, we have steadily lost a competitive footprint in the global landscape. In the same breath, our manufacturing sector used to make up more than 20% of GDP. It now makes up early double digits % of GDP. Again, sort of evidencing our loss of competitiveness. And the big component that is missing there is our network industries, unreliable energy, inadequate, insufficient transport logistics infrastructure. We have to get those right. Thankfully, we found ourselves in day 156 or 157 of uninterrupted energy, now to the transport industry.
So when it comes to the two-way investment idea, where do you see the opportunities for Chinese investors in South Africa and vice versa, South Africa into China?
Well, I think, let's go the other way around. Let's go the prospect of Chinese investment into Africa, because the Chinese economy is overinvested. The marginal return on capital in China is very, very modest. They've enjoyed decades of extremely elevated investment, and it's in South Africa that you're likely to find the greatest possible marginal returns on capital rather than in China. And we can then start to point very quickly to examples of big successful projects. Modderfontein is one that springs, not far from my home, one that springs immediately to mind. And that South Africa has access to two critical resources that would be of enduring value to China, the first being hard commodities and the other being soft commodities. And by that, I mean metals, minerals, and then agriculture. There are huge prospects in exploiting these competitive positionings for both partners. There could truly be win-win outcomes through that type of collaboration and cooperation.
Yeah. And Adrian, just a short answer, please, to a difficult question. There's been some disquiet in some quarters about South Africa veering increasingly to the east in terms of its diplomatic and economic relations. How does it, strike the balance between getting cozier with Eastern countries like China, while at the same time maintaining its relations with its traditional Western partners?
Short answer, learn from President Modi in India, who's been able to face East and West with great success.
Indeed. Perfect. Thank you so much. That was Professor Adrian Saville. He's from the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And as I said, he wears many hats. He's in academia, investment and business.